My guest today has made it their life's work to deeply understand people and cultures. Through a decade of pioneering research across the continents, they've uncovered surprising truths about human behavior that has shaped products used by billions. And their trailblazing studies have spanned everything from digital music habits to social media use across the world. And the insights they've distilled from these mountains of survey and interview data, they've weaved it into compelling narratives to persuade risk averse executives to shift directions. And they've pushed companies to build more ethical products that create value for society. So today, I'm thrilled to welcome Abbas Jaffer, principal researcher at Circle, to the Samelogic podcast. Abbas, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's jump right into the questions. You have an impressive background spanning anthropology, Islamic studies, and now product research. How has your diverse education and experience informed the way you approach user research today?
Great place to start. I think that as we're looking back and trying to construct what we've taken from each chapter of our lives to carry us forward, I think I have one a big thing, so to speak, from each of those areas. So I think if you take it back even further, in my undergrad, I studied international studies, and that gave me that curiosity about cultural and political systems around the world. I, yes, did a master's in theological studies, and I was focused on the changing landscape of gender roles and relations in the Islamic world, and quite interesting when it comes to the intersection of culture and religion. And then I got interested in sort of live religion alongside other cultural phenomena, and so that's where the social anthropology came into play, and did doctoral studies kind of looking at where these things kind of intersect in contemporary society, the digital music that you mentioned. And what I took away from that was there's that classic line about anthropology that is best making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. I love
Mm.
that. I think that it continues to be a good, pithy way for me to think about how to look at how human beings are encountering technology. So that all sort of accumulated together, combined with some self-claimed opportunities as a independent consultant, which I'm happy to talk about too, led to, user UX research and really started me down this path. Like accumulating all of those ways of thinking have been very valuable in being inclusive, being broad in the aperture when I look at where a product could be most valuable and serve people the best. And then I think finally in how it can help and does intersect with other meaningful things in people's lives. Meaning making is all about deciding what's important to you. And frankly, in this day and age, like our technology products are part of people's meaning making around the world. And I can confirm that because I've learned that through a lot of the research that you mentioned.
What first sparked your interest in anthropology and qual research?
Yeah. So I remember somebody telling me that you should follow something that speaks to your temperament and something that speaks to what you're most curious about. And so my temperament is I am an extremely extroverted person. I gain energy from interacting with people one on one or in a crowd. And in terms of my curiosity, very curious, was naturally, and then discovered anthropology, giving me a set of words and a set of frameworks to understand that curiosity about how other people chose to arrange their lives. Really
Mm.
always curious about it. A story I have from kind of growing up is I grew up on the north side of Chicago. And I can remember my family driving down Lakeshore Drive and seeing the other cars on the road and honestly thinking to myself, which in hindsight is like, oh, makes total sense why I went in this field, is wondering, what's their story? Where are they headed to? Like what's important to to that kid that's the same age as me, but in a very different life circumstance than I am.
So, pretty much, you have like a very interesting career path as well, and you pretty much bridge social sciences with tech. That's pretty cool. My wife is also like she studied anthropology, so a lot of times seeing things like through her eyes, it's very like it opens your mind to so much. Sometimes when you're in the space, did you feel like an outsider when you're coming into this space, or how was it when you were moving like from the path of academia into tech?
What's interesting is that the trail for this more broadly in the social science arena was blazed by psychologists mostly, that were the first social scientists to get into UX research. And they had been doing so. Academic programs were sort of amenable and friendly to that transition. And so you had folks in the early days, UX research, and then before UX research, HCI, human computer interaction, encapsulated all of what is today become like its own discrete discipline, that kind of research. And that was a combination, again, of psychologists with people looking at like biomechanics and the actual ergonomics. For anthropology, which is, could be, has been controversial in terms of people using terms to describe it, but they call it a humanistic social science. I would say for the humanistic social sciences, it has been more of a journey to help people connect the dots there. So, yeah, I'd say when starting, definitely felt like an outsider. I think at first approached it as, the organization that I was working for as, an object of analysis, because that's what I was used to. And so my default was to say, okay, let me understand what works here. Let me understand the formal, informal power structures, all those sort of classic anthro lenses to look at stuff. And I think learning that language over the years on the job about what are priorities for a business? What are they trying to accomplish? How can they be in business sustainably as a result of meeting certain targets? All of those things were a language I had to learn. In the same way that I mentioned, I had this innate curiosity that didn't have a language until I became an anthropologist. I understood at some naive level about how enterprises need to function and grow, but I didn't learn that language, I would say, until, going within companies and then really learning and appreciating it, and especially helping people tie this social science background, theory, practice to the business problems that they have.
And what was the biggest culture shock you'd say that you experienced in that transition?
I would say biggest one is timelines. So it's really interesting that the bar for academic research means that in order for it to actually get published in journals or as freestanding books, your timelines are years long
Hmm.
on an individual topic that you go back to over and over. And, at a private company, your timelines are okay, like, can you give us a sense of in a month's time how you can go from a maybe not yet firmed up question or problem that the business is having to having insights that can be useful and it can be impactful to the company's operations. So I think that was a huge culture shock. It was a very big change in sort of thinking about how deep to go on a particular topic, who to talk to, and also thinking about making trade-offs. What can you learn about people's experience in an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours versus, in your graduate field work, or if you're in academia, you might engage with the same respondents for years, this exact same small set. So that was a huge culture shock, definitely.
What would you say are like some of the key differences that you've noticed in the ways how research gets done in academia and how it's done at tech companies, and how are the studies or the findings applied in the different categories?
So I think that in academic research, institutions, departments, journals are often looking for, can you make causal inferences? Can you say A or maybe A and B causes cause C or C and D effects. Can you draw that solid line for us? And can it be extremely rigorous in terms of how you came to that conclusion? So, in the anther world, it's sort of like, okay, this theory and these observations help me tell you about social causes and effects in a really
Mm,
robust way. And how is that used? That's used in academia. The phrase that's always used is building new knowledge. So it's sort of building new knowledge for the sake of expanding our human understanding, kind of more broadly. In the enterprise, the research is largely framed up as what can help us understand this question or problem that we're facing. And how it's used is what are short, medium, and long term interventions that company can make. So that could be product, that could be in operations, that could be in customer service, that could be in a lot of different arenas in order to address this business question or business problem. So the application, not only the framing of it is quite different, but the application of it, where on the academic side, it's new knowledge. We want to add new knowledge to the body of knowledge that we have in a discipline. And the enterprise, it is what are short, medium, and long term things that the company can do to actually address the insights that you gained.
after looking at like tons of like survey data, interview data, talking with like tons of people in focus groups, different things like that. What's one thing that surprises you about people and cultures after so many years of being in the industry?
I had a little bit of appreciation for it, but not as much as I do today, of how much our sort of human cross-cultural reaction to technologies is very cyclical. So what do I mean by cyclical? Everyone sort of has heard about the idea of a tech hype cycle. That's fine. What I would introduce and talk more about is the idea of the tech anxiety cycle. And I'm actually grateful that I got to look in the past when I was studying at things like the introduction of the telephone in homes or the introduction of the personal computer and how people were worried about it. They were, you might say, moral panics. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to the children, is always like a cyclically. It's really wild. Like you go like, all right, 30 years back, then, 70 years back, and then 120 years back, different technological things. Same thing with electrification and the telegraph. You didn't think I was going to talk about the telegraph today, but here we are. A real anxiety, moral panics among certain parts of populations in different countries. And then you have really new ways of doing things start to percolate out to society. And then people say, oh, okay, I also want to experiment. Or this successful experiment is something cool and will improve my quality of life. So I want to adopt these pieces like cafeteria, like picking food items in the cafeteria. Like there's technology to do all this different stuff. Here are pieces that I feel will help me A, make meaning in my life, or B, and or, make my life practically better. So that's
Mm,
been the really interesting thing to see on the front line of doing applied research, because I could read about it all day in terms of history and the theory, et cetera. But to actually be engaging users that are going through these negotiations, navigating these, moral panics in some cases, right? Like AI is a good recent phenomenon where there's lots of moral panics, but those aren't new. Those reactions aren't new. What they're reacting to is new in the moment.
So let's keep it a bit on topic here. We everyone's like talking about AI. How do you think the next 2 to 3 years will look as we go through this change? As you mentioned, a few people, well, not a few, many people are like scared of the fact that their jobs may go away. But like digging deeper, like how do you see the next like 3 to 5 years looking, or as well like the user perception of like how do you think user perceptions will change as well based on what you've seen?
A couple of things come to mind based on what I've been learning. I think one thing is that among sort of AI engineers and technologists writ large that focus on this area, there's often this conversation about alignment, right? Aligning the development of AI with human priorities and needs. I think what you will start to see is more and more proliferation of examples of in real life what alignment could look like in terms of the development iteration of different machine learning models as they get more and more advanced to align to work needs or personal needs of people in different places around the world. They could be in response to their constraints, like maybe they have a need to have smarter grids because they have rolling blackouts where they live. Maybe they have, a need to. There's a lot of companies pitching AI assistance for everyday tasks. So I think you'll see alignment examples in terms of serving people's priorities, like spending time with their loved ones, finding meaning in their life and work. So alignment is one, like the real practical observation of alignment out in the wild. That's the first thing I think you're going to see more and more of, which is interesting. And then the second thing I think you'll see in the next 3 to 5 is the idea of more and more abstracting away that this interaction is happening with an AI at all. There's been a lot of discussion about where companies will go with saying, "Hey, you're talking to an AI," or "Hey, this feature is powered by AI." Right now, and in this current moment, that is sort of seen as a value proposition that people will respond positively to. And I think in the next few years, you're going to start seeing things that have an amazing user experience that work really well. And part of the reason they do is because of embedding of AI technologies in those products, rather than having it be a headline value proposition for the product itself. So I think you're going to see a lot more of those two things happening out there.
Lovely. So, what's your favorite research method and why?
I'm going to cheat and say two, because I think the two that I was trained the most on, I find kind of the most interesting, like from a curiosity and learning standpoint. The first is in-depth interviewing, when they can be longer interviews where you can get into where the business you're coming from or the product that you're researching fits into their lives, as I mentioned before. And so a longer period of time lets you contextualize where they're using what you're doing. So if I was doing a project on investment, retail investment, it's been really interesting to see where in their home they decide to do that investment. Is it on the couch, on their smartphone? Is it at their work desk? In a separate tab from their work stuff, kind of looking back and forth while they're doing their work. How are they using it? And then the second one is real participant observation, which is doing the stuff that your participants are doing and interacting with them kind of and learning as you're doing it. And so, the area that I focus on a lot today is research with developers. And so doing the development, creating lightweight applications, learning curve for sure. But I think doing that in a structured way and then engaging with the developers doing this full time creates not only a better sense of empathy and actual understanding what they're doing, but also you can have like an embodied experience. You're like, wow, that is frustrating. Like you can tell me that definitely, or you can make a survey response and tell me that. But I can advocate for your needs even better if I felt some of that akin in terms of the frustrations you had.
What's one of the most misunderstood thing about anthropology and qualitative research in the tech world?
I'd say still today, it's really this idea that the N numbers in qualitative research are too small to draw conclusions from. This is depending on the kind of organizational exposure to this type of research. I can understand how lack of exposure would lead to that point of view. However, there are two principles that I've always found helpful in teaching stakeholders and getting companies, whole companies, to be on board with this form of research as complementary to a lot of that quantitative work that they're already doing. So I think the first thing is understanding workarounds or hacks where a product comes up short. You can not get that level of detail from any other type of research than deeper qualitative research because it's not as though you're going to come into a conversation and ask a leading question, which is what are workarounds you use when you're trying to do this and you can't. Like that's just poor question design. And so that for that reason, you're not going to ask a sort of question in a survey and get a response that's going to really be enlightening. You need to do a back and forth with the users that you're talking to understand what those workarounds might be. And those workarounds can end up being features you actually support in your product long term. I've seen that happen many times. Second thing I like to talk about is this concept of saturation. So in qualitative research, what's saturation? It means that you can see patterns emerge after only a few conversations, which is actually breathtaking to see it, especially for the first time when you haven't experienced it before. That you think, oh, well, I need dozens of conversations in order to start to see patterns in a user population. It's just frankly not true. And when you have and you bring those stakeholders along and they feel some of that saturation, you can guide them as a researcher too. You can call out then, okay, sitting with this, understanding this lived experience, and then how it relates to our product. These patterns are emerging that are patterns of a different kind than statistically significant patterns in quantitative research. They're just different in terms of category. So those two things, I think, are either not understood at all until you introduce them, or misunderstood about the power of it to help guide organizations.
And what's some advice or a piece of advice you'd have to present research in a compelling way to stakeholders or execs?
Let's take the executive leadership. Basically, I think the two principles that, or let's say three principles that are helpful in effectively doing research storytelling at that altitude in the organization. One is being very concise. Have your detail available if asked. That's the way to operate. That's the way to have all of the supporting information at their fingertips, but to give them the punchline in terms of here are the few things that mattered and my interpretation and what I think we should do about it to start that conversation. And that's the first thing. I think the second thing is to try and get in live forums, and live could be remote or in person, with those execs rather than handing off, let's say, a report, as we have to do often in many other circumstances. I think with that audience in particular, you really want to make sure that you have a chance to have a conversation with them. And a live conversation is often the most effective because you have a chance to sort of have a back and forth rather than questions on an email thread to a report you wrote. And then I think the third one is, and again, it took me time to realize this, is creative deliverables are actually really valuable for an executive audience. It gets their attention, it gets them thinking and engaged. And so I've been a part of or seen everything from creating like a digital zine for a study. I've seen mini museums, which a lot of companies, researchers do, which I think is great, like a physical space that leaders can walk through and then engage with the data and what you've learned. And podcasts, just to get a little meta here, we're on, on podcasts right now, but that format is different. It interrupts this, what I would say, especially with a hybrid work environment, even more of a feeling of yet another document, especially when you're an overtaxed, time scarce executive. How do you cut through that noise? So I think that's the third thing is creative deliverables.
I love that. So, Abbas, this is my last question here. I ask everyone on the show, and this is my question: what's one weakness that you've turned into your strength?
Fantastic question. I think that a weakness I've had in the past is not being able to say, I don't know. I think a weakness was feeling the pressure. You could call it perfectionism, you could call it feeling like needing to be the smartest guy in the room, insecurity, honestly, about being able to admit when one doesn't know something. And I feel like I've turned that into a strength because I and people that work with me day to day can tell you this too. I am not only learned the behavior to be a lot more comfortable saying I don't know, but then also to say, do we know? Who could we go to answer this question? You know, how much understanding do I have, and how much understanding do we have collectively, like as an organization, really, when it comes down to it? And so I think being that voice in the room, being that I don't know, and does anybody else? And if nobody in this room knows, how are we going to find out? Has been incredibly powerful as I've proceeded in my career.
I love that. Abbas, thanks for joining us on today's episode. Where can our listeners find you if they'd love to connect?
Yeah. So they are welcome to contact me. LinkedIn, probably these days, is where I'll be kind of most frequently able to engage with folks, answer questions. Super happy to. And yeah, kind of take it from there. I'd say, even though I worked in social media, I've definitely pared down my social media a fair amount. So yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Got 10 Minutes podcast by Samelogic. To stay in touch, please follow us on LinkedIn or the podcast app you're listening to this on right now for more episodes. I'm Dwayne Samuels. Take care.